Okay, that was quite a fancy introduction. So my name is Tom Borgers. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called 3Mint. We build Web3 tools for brands, creators, and of course, developers. Before starting 3Mint, I spent a number of years at Consensus, which is a company that built a lot of infrastructure and developer tools in the Ethereum space in particular. You may be familiar with MetaMask. That was a product built by Consensus, and I am very fortunate to have worked with product teams like MetaMask and Infura, and so on before starting 3Mint. So, on to the subject of conversation. Let's start with this scary-ish looking graph, right? So, if you've been following the crypto space, you know that we're no strangers to the ups and downs of the market. And this is a chart of the Ethereum price over the last few years. You'll see that it looks a little bit like a roller coaster ride, and it very much has been. But this is often, a conversation about price. And frankly, that's not super interesting to me, and hopefully not super interesting to you as well. And despite where we are kind of there on the right-hand side of the chart, quite a ways down from the peaks, today I pretty much remain as convinced as ever that Web3 is here to stay. And so really, we could name this talk, Why I Still Believe in Crypto. And that's really the question that I'm going to try to answer. I'm going to try to answer the question of why Web3 in a general sense, and then specifically, like, where does it make sense to use Web3 technology, to use Web3 primitives, and then we'll cover a few examples to show you kind of what's being done today and how long we've come over the past few years. But to start, let's kind of set the context a little bit and start with some fundamentals around Web3, right? So the term Web3 is really just a sexier name for general purpose blockchains, as well as the apps that run on top of those chains and the whole ecosystems that have been built around it, right? So you'll hear a lot about the Ethereum ecosystem or the Polygon ecosystem, the Solana ecosystem, etc. These ecosystems as a whole are kind of what make up what we call Web3. And when I talk about general purpose blockchains, I'm really talking about these public blockchain networks that support smart contracts. So not something like Bitcoin, which is kind of single use case, but something more general that uses those same technology primitives to allow for a lot more stuff, right? And I don't want to go too much into the details of what specifically defines a blockchain, but broadly speaking, these general purpose blockchains are networks of distributed computers that are all kind of running the same program to execute a consensus algorithm to jointly agree on the global state of that virtual computer or database, okay? And so then completing the picture, there's typically a token, like Bitcoin has, Bitcoin, and then Ethereum has Ether. And that really comes in as an incentive to participate in the security of the network. So it gets people to actually participate in validating the whole network. A little bit of a simplification, but should work for us. And so what are you left with? There's kind of the three main things, right? A network of computers or nodes running a, sorry, I'm having a little issue here, running a virtual machine with a native token that can be used as a currency. Okay, so those are kind of like the tech primitives, very simplified. But what does that leave us with? We have a few key properties of Web3 that make Web3 essentially useful, right? And part of this talk is really about kind of identifying what makes sense, right? And it makes sense if you care about these properties. If you don't, maybe don't use Web3, right? So starting kind of on the left hand side there, the first one we talk about a lot is openness. And specifically, that means not permissioned, right? So anybody can read the state on the blockchain, right? Anybody can write to that state, generally speaking. But not only that, anyone can participate in the actual validation and verification of this global blockchain state, right? And that's pretty powerful because it means anybody can kind of create programs on here that will run, and anybody can access it from anywhere in the world, right? And so that's very tied to this next concept of universality. And here what I'm talking about is the fact that we're talking about one global ledger that anyone in the world can kind of read to. And given that blockchains are programmable, that's very important because you have this one kind of reference point that anybody can program on top of, right? So it's very much interoperable by default and composable by default, right? And permissionlessly composable. So anybody can kind of build things on top of things that have already been published or deployed on a blockchain network, right? Also connected to that is this whole idea of decentralization. If you talk to anyone in the crypto or Web3 space, it's always decentralization, et cetera, et cetera. But really what that means is that you have this global network of nodes where any single node is not more powerful than the other, right? So we're trying to remove any kind of centralized point of failure, which has big implications in terms of security of the network, reliability of the network, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum has never gone down in years now, as well as censorship resistance, right? Which I'll turn to next. And what we mean here is explicitly this idea that if you're publishing data on the blockchain, no one can censor you, right? So you're always going to be able to execute a transaction without someone censoring you. That is also connected to ownership, a very kind of central idea in the blockchain space. And actually, when you think about it, it's really the flip side of the coin of decentralization in many ways. The more decentralized something is, the more it relies on you as the owner of whatever's happening on that network. And so the more ownership you actually have over data and assets that are living on that network. Just to kind of put a point on that, what's yours is truly yours on a blockchain, so any kind of asset. No one can freeze your assets, and no one can kind of decline a transaction or anything like that, right? And so that brings us to the last thing, which is kind of part and parcel with blockchains generally, and specifically in terms of like how they're practically used, and that's this idea of digital assets, right? So we know blockchain is a virtual computer. It's a database. So we are talking about exchanges of data, storing data, and typically that data can take a few different forms. Essentially, you have the fungible kind of data where any one thing can be exchanged or interoperable with another, right? One Bitcoin is one Bitcoin. Same thing as €1 is any other €1, right? It's the same thing, and that's very useful in terms of currencies and things like that. And so we've had these standards that have emerged around that kind of data on a blockchain. And so you have like the native coins such as Bitcoin and Ether, and then you've got all these other coins that can be built on top of systems like Ethereum. Then you have the other kind of data, which is, in my opinion, even more interesting, which is the unique data, right? So the non-fungible kind of data, and that has basically gotten the very sexy term non-fungible token. And you have standards that have emerged around that called ERC 721 and ERC 1155. The names of the standards are not very important, but what is important is that everybody in the space is using these same standards, which kind of goes with the idea of interoperability and composability, right? You're always talking about the same building blocks, and that's really important when you're trying to build persistent applications and things like that over time. Okay, so that's that. And then lastly, what we'll do, now that we have some of these fundamentals, is think about when we actually want to use Web3 versus not. And here, it's useful to think about it in the sense of what do we actually want to be on chain versus not, right? And the answer is there's not going to be that much on chain. And another way to think about it is Web3 does not replace Web2, right, or the internet as we know it. It's just a complement and a different way to think about how data is stored, used, accessed, etc. Right? And I'm a big fan of these flowcharts here, and you'll see that in a lot of cases you don't use a blockchain, right? But when you do, really has to do with those properties that we were talking about earlier. Those are the things that we really want in here. And just to kind of wrap this whole section up, when you're thinking about do you use a blockchain and is it interesting to use Web3, it's essentially useful as a database for parties who want to work with each other but don't necessarily really trust each other, right? That's when having a credibly neutral global platform like Web3 really comes into play. Okay, so congratulations, you are now all Web3 experts. It's time to change your LinkedIn profiles. And now we can really think about kind of the use cases that can be built on top of these technology primitives. Now, there's not just four, but these are kind of four central ones that are very important to me and really fundamental to how you should think about Web3, right? And now we'll start kind of on the left-hand side, which is, for me, kind of the most basic, fundamental, but important use case in Web3, which is payments, right? And it kind of goes all the way back to the beginning of Bitcoin. That was why Bitcoin was created by Satoshi Nakamoto, right? It was supposed to be some kind of digital cash that could actually work on a large scale. Now, we've come up with better things since, but essentially the idea is that you want some kind of system which allows for global, cross-border, instantaneously settled exchanges of value, right? A programmable money that works everywhere, and that can really unlock a whole range of different use cases. But for me, that's something really important. If you've ever tried to, exchange or send money internationally, you know how much of a pain that can be. If you've ever worked abroad and tried to get money back home, super huge pain in the ass. And this is really about, instead of trying to bring together all these fragmented financial systems that exist, let's start with something that's just global by default and build on top of that, right? And so to extend that use case, of course, once you have that censorship-resistant global money, you can build a whole financial system around it. And that's really the promise of what we call decentralized finance, or DeFi. And really that's a programmable decentralized finance, which allows you to add to money things like credit, different financial instruments, etc., that utilize the payments angle, but go way beyond that. And you'll notice that as we go from left to right here, we're going from something that's a purely fungible token to things that involve kind of more unique assets under NFTs, right? So you could think about tokenizing an equity or a land grant or something like that on chain as an NFT. Now, moving past that to less strictly financial use cases, you have what initially sounds really boring, a registry, but actually is very interesting, because essentially any time that you need a kind of global canonical database or source of truth, data source, that's really what I'm calling a registry, right? So you can think about registries for land, about identity, things like that, where it makes sense to have a credibly neutral database where anybody can point to and verify that I am this or I have done that, and so on, without any tampering and preserving immutability and things like that, right? And as an extension to that, once you have that kind of truth of source or source of truth data source, you can also use it for things like credentials and certificates, right? People can issue these kinds of certificates and credentials on this kind of registry, and then you can always kind of verify and make sure that this is legitimate as a credential, and so on. And then finally, we have digital assets in a natively digital context, which I will also call digital collectibles. But essentially, the idea here is that, you know, more and more of what we do, of our activity, is digital to begin with. And this can, you know, go from like toy examples like gaming, but all the way through to kind of where we work and how we work and all of that, right? And so if we have a lot of these kind of digital environments and digital contexts, it makes sense to have digitally native assets, right? Traditionally, it's been very difficult to prove kind of authenticity or provenance of something that is digital, like a file or something like that. But with NFTs as a standard, that can be possible, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about each of these with a few examples, starting with cross-border payments. This is something that's been brewing for a while, but now we actually have real live company startups that are allowing this. And you know, I'm talking about one of them called Parallax, but there are many others such as Beam and Sling Money and so on. And essentially, what all of how these startups work, they're essentially fintech companies, but their backend is using Web3, specifically stablecoins like USDC, to exchange money globally, and then they're plugging into local you know, financial systems to do that last mile, like withdrawal or deposit of cash, right? So in this example, with Parallax, you can create basically a virtual account for USD or I think Euro anywhere in the world. You can send money for basically $0. There's very little fees, and it's much faster than Wise or PayPal, for example. And then you can withdraw to local bank accounts, or if you don't have a bank account, you can also withdraw to you know, apps like Revolut or Grab if you're in Asia or something like that, right? That is example number one. Example number two is something called FriendTech. If you follow the crypto space at all, you know that this has been kind of a huge thing recently. It's a pretty interesting demonstration of what you can do. In a nutshell, FriendTech is a decentralized social network where you can tokenize yourself almost, or at least your social network, and sell shares of your social network to your followers and your friends. People who hold on to those shares could accrue value that comes to your social network. You also benefit from any trading activity that happens with those shares, and then essentially, you know, you own your social network. You have a direct connection with everybody that's on the network that is disintermediated. You can create private or semi-private communities as well as the public ones that you already have. And of course, you know, you benefit from the value accrual of your network, right? So the more people that own your shares and follow you, essentially, the more those shares are going to be worth. So it's an interesting demonstration. I would encourage you to try it if you're interested at all in this kind of stuff. It's very simple in terms of the onboarding experience. They've really simplified it. You don't need a crypto wallet. And you also, it's a progressive web app, so you don't need to actually download anything to get started. So very simple and a pretty interesting demonstration. Last example is, again, this idea of digital assets in native context. I want to talk about two different brands kind of really pioneering this right now. One is Nike with their .swoosh platform. The other is Reddit with their collectible avatars. And essentially in both cases, what they're doing is they're inviting in community members, creators, artists, and so on to generate these collectibles on one side for Reddit, and then actual shoe designs and so on the Nike side. And they're allowing them, with the distribution that Reddit and Nike have, to sell them and earn a fee for those sales. So they're really participating in the value creation process as a community member. And then it doesn't stop there, right? So Reddit allows you to form different subreddits that are only accessible by the holders of those collectibles. So again, creating these semi-private communities. And then Nike is also bringing in their big pipeline of athletes into the program and bringing that value in as well. And both sides are also, they recognize the value of the interoperability and the potential for collaborations with other parties, which is made very easy by NFTs as a standard. And so Reddit is partnering with the NFL in the US, Alpine here in Europe, to basically create different types of collections and allow for redeeming of benefits in those other environments. And similarly, Nike is working with Fortnite. We don't know exactly the details yet, but the idea is essentially you can use these assets that you've created as skins in games like Fortnite, and surely that will extend to different contexts as well. So that's really just kind of scratching the surface a little bit. This stuff is very much brand focused, and we at 3mint work with different brands and creators to basically power things like this. If you're at all interested in trying some of this out, we definitely encourage you to give it a try on 3mint.io. It's free to get started. Essentially, we provide you a fully managed service to create these kinds of digital collectibles and tokens. And there is a full API suite. So if you wanted to programmatically do any of this, like creating collections, distributing them, selling them, and then doing like dynamic NFTs and collectibles, that is all possible. And if you have any questions on that, definitely feel free to ask me. Thank you so much for your time. Feel free to get in touch at tom@3mint.io or follow me on LinkedIn, Tom Borgers, same thing on Twitter. Thanks so much.